Hello everybody, welcome to the Eternal Card Breakdown, or rather the Eternal Patch Breakdown. We're going to be talking about the balance changes that are going into play tomorrow. Direwolf was kind enough to announce the patch changes ahead of time this time around, so we're going to be basically discussing everything that's going to be coming up basically on Thursday. So there's a lot of new changes, in fact. Some very, very serious nerfs to Winchest, to Smugglers, to a bunch of other cards that are like just really, really a little out of control right now in the current meta. And yeah, I think overall, like, I was looking at these changes and hot damn are these good changes. Like, I am very, very excited about what's going on with these changes and what kind of stuff we're going to be getting into, because there's like a lot of really, really good stuff out there. Like, we got changes that not only would I have recommended, but some that I hadn't even thought of. Like a couple that I think are like particularly good and that I've actually been kind of pining for and hoping for a while on stream. So let's go ahead and talk about what all's happening. First things first, we're going to go into some of the basic Winchest nerfs, because as we know, Winchest had a pretty strong representation in the current tournament. Like, it was very, very popular, primarily due to a high quantity of lifesteal units, the incredible power of Red Canyon Smuggler, and the power, of course, of Zoe, the ridiculous 7-cost dragon. Zoe's a cool dragon, and I think that card did not actually get nerfed, which I'm pretty happy with. Like, you know, it's a cool dragon. I'm definitely excited to see people playing with it, but a lot of the cards that are sort of built around Zoe and have sort of made that deck like really what it is did get hit, and we're going to be talking about all of those in turn. First things first, Smugglers. Red Canyon Smuggler. I believe we've talked about this card a bunch before, but this card on its own is just by far the most powerful merchant out there. Like, it is a 2/3 with double damage, and like basically it just completely dominates every time that it plays on board. You have to kill it, or it will Deep Forge Plate, or it will put like some sort of flying card on itself, or it will basically do any number of other ridiculous things that will just cause you to immediately die as a top deck effect, which is pretty scary for a merchant. Like, this card is overall just really, really strong. It's got a lot of good things going for it, and there is a nerf to it, so it's going from 2/3 to a 2/2. That'll keep it at enough damage that it can still do all of its weird little shenanigans, but it makes it a little bit easier to kill. You can now manage it with a bunch of other abilities, and weapons placed on it will still not make it quite as bad to deal with. So, for example, one thing that can happen here now that you have Red Canyon Smuggler as a 2/2 is that if you play it and then put an Inquisitor's Blade on top of it, your opponent can torch it and basically reward you for your greed in a way that is actually like good counterplay and good predictive, like fun interaction. Like, I think that kind of thing is really, really important. Like, fast spell damage, like Mortar and Torch, being better able to kill these types of cards, as well as like being better able to trade with these types of cards by preparing adequately for what it is that your opponent is marketing, allows you to sort of use that sort of predictability of merchants and actually just deal with it in the ways that you prefer. Like, I think that good skilled players can have a better time with Smuggler now, and also just the general stat decrease should make this card a little bit less dominant and should make Rakano a little bit less dominant in the like future, which, I mean, basically everything in the top 64 or so, the top 32 or so was Rakano or Winchest in the latest tournaments. Like, this was a deck that was like pretty dominant, about 60% of the meta for like that particular tournament. So I'm glad they changed it. They changed it right on time. Like, this wasn't out for more than like, this wasn't a huge issue for more than like a week or two, but it has been something that has been gradually growing, and clearly like it got out of control, and now they put a stop to it in a way that I do think is very satisfying. I was on board with this card being nerfed from the beginning. I did think it was too strong, and yeah, it's definitely gotten probably what it deserves. The other card that has been taken down a point is Hidden Road Smuggler, which is being reduced from 3/3 to 2/3. So this card obviously is very good as well. Like, it's quite capable of keeping you alive against all manner of different decks. It really kind of shuts down aggro in some scary ways, and combined with Red Canyon Smuggler, it really just made Winchest absolutely ridiculous, because they are the two strongest smugglers on the list. Like, I would say that Howling Peak was a card that I would love to see like get an extra point of health, and Ebon Dune was another card that maybe could have seen like a little bit of a buff, but like Hidden Road and Red Canyon are so good as to be completely oppressive, and so I think that this card being taken down a little bit actually robs it of a lot of its value. This is a harder hit than Red Canyon's hit, just because the lifesteal on it was really, really relevant. The ability to trade with bigger to mid-range units of its own size was quite an issue. Like, I think that, like, Argenport takes a really, really big hit from this, just because, like, this card was able to stabilize you in a lot of different ways, and now it just doesn't give you as much life, and it doesn't trade with as many scary units as you would previously be able to trade with. Most importantly, it doesn't trade very well against some Rakano stuff now, like Whirling Duo and a lot of the, like, sort of Warcry buffed options. Like, there's some things that, like, not quite as capable of dealing with. I think this is a good move just in order to curtail the amount of, like, extremely good lifesteal that's out there, but overall this does make the Merchant, you know, pretty much in line with Howling Peak and Ebon Dune and Great Valley. It is definitely not that powerful of a card. I would say that Red Canyon, after the nerf, is probably still the strongest of the smugglers, but all of them are now sort of in line to be pretty good, but not so good that they are actually oppressive. So that's a pretty good change, and I do really appreciate them sort of like making an effort to curtail lifesteal. There's a lot of changes to lifesteal stuff here. Okay, let's talk about some other lifesteal stuff. Rezon Greatbow Master. Rezon Greatbow Master has... I've been thinking about how to change this card for a while, because I have always sort of thought that it was just like a little bit better than Ikaria, where it was capable of just like doing a lot more a little bit earlier, and then when Ikaria got nerfed, Rezon clearly just became the Ikaria, where Rakano was just always happy to play it, and basically it would always get them out of tough situations and get them into like a really, really good spot against like a bunch of other decks. And the thing that this really basically brought a rise to was Combustion Cell decks first, and then sort of these like bigger Argenport Greed decks where you have a lot of card draw in other formats, and as long as you have the lifesteal to stay alive, like that is just like sort of what you're doing with the deck. Like, it was clearly a pretty tricky thing to deal with, and Rezon is the kind of card that you want to have like a lot of value on board as soon as it's played. Like, it is something where the drawbacks to the card are basically need to be worth the risks, and they changed it in a way that I think actually really adds that sort of flavor to it. So Rezon's new change is that he only has lifesteal when you have 6 or more spells in your void. So Rezon will always be a 5/4 flyer that's a huge beater that can actually take the game. It has Reckless, which means that it's going to not be very good at blocking, and that's a little bit rough, but behaves very well with a lot of Rakano's general themes. Warcry with relic weapons, with like all of the different stuff that sort of just makes big flyers work, with big dragons. Like, there's a lot of things that basically just make this still a pretty good mid-rangey threat, but no longer does he always save you when you're in like a really, really tough spot. As soon as you get to 6, it's no longer the point where you are just suddenly going to recover 3 life and then another 5 and just continue to destroy your opponent's aggro strategy in a way that is just really, really threatening. I think this is a very, very good change. It doesn't change Rezon's overall power level, but it changes the way that he's used and what kind of things that he is capable of doing. It does change his power level quite a bit. This is a much weaker card as a result of not being able to be played in a lot of the like bigger decks that want to like have that kind of greed, but like I would say that the amount of life that he gains is no longer going to be like completely oppressive to that sort of aggro style, and I can see aggro coming back quite a bit as a result of Rezon's change. Like, that is a really, really big deal. Okay, Ankle Cutter. So in addition to cutting some of the lifesteal units, we have got some new buffs that are going to be also allowing us to provide ourselves with tools to deal with lifesteal units in the future. And these are things that definitely probably should have been out to begin with, but Ankle Cutter is kind of an interesting one as far as like what they're trying to do. So Ankle Cutter now hits not only endurance units, but lifesteal units. Basically, if a unit with lifesteal takes damage, you immediately kill it. So a red deck that's running a lot of torches and signal flares and kind of aggressive strategies with a lot of burn, piercing shots, all of that kind of stuff, can now sort of break through lifesteal units in a way that can really help you out. And another card, one of my favorites, and one of the cards that I've basically been asking to be 2 for ages and ages, no longer costs 3, it costs 2. Factory Quota now is a 2-cost relic that says players can't gain health, and at the end of each player's turn, if they didn't play a unit, deal 2 damage to them. So this is like I think really where the brunt of the lifesteal changes take place, is the ability to add sufficient counterplay in both markets and in main boards for aggressive style decks. Aggressive decks just didn't have a lot of good options against lifesteal units. They could run a lot of fast spells and go into like sort of a burn style to try and kill them, but shutting off lifesteal is pretty hard. You have to either do Groundbreaker, which is the 3/6 for triple fire, just a really hard card to run out, and also a card that is mostly only good if you manage to get the spark. Or you could do Factory Quota, a card that I think has a lot of cool play to it, but the main problem with it was that like when you played it, you were very frequently unable to play a unit yourself, which meant that your opponent could respond to it by playing their own units until they ran out of units, and then breaking the factory quota with a bore or a ruin in some way that basically just meant that you took some damage. You might even have taken a lot of damage because you basically have an aggressive strategy, and then like after that, like they get to basically just use your factory quota against you until it no longer suits them, and they have some lifesteal unit that they actually want to get out, like a Razan. So this card being a little bit more aggressive, allowing you to play it with 2-drops and 1-drops, means that I think you're actually going to get some actual play of this card out of the market from cards like Red Canyon Smuggler and Ixtun Merchant, as well as maybe in some main boards for decks that really just want to shut off hard control. Previously, the rate on this card was just not good enough, and the ability to, like, once it was destroyed, like, it was just very rarely going to get you the value that you wanted. Being able to cast it faster makes a huge difference for this card, and I think it's actually going to see a lot more play as a result of this. So this is a solid option for like aggressive to controlling types of decks that are going to play a lot of units. Praxis tokens could come back a little bit as a result of this, and you could see a lot of other token style decks or things that play a lot of units and a lot of aggressive strategies using this relic in the market at the very least. I think a smuggler option is very good. Okay, I turned off the heaters so there would be less background noise, but I'm freezing. It's very cold here in Portland today, so we're going to turn that back on, and I apologize if there's a hum. All right. Next up, Howling Peak. I suppose everyone saw this one coming. Howling Peak was by far the most powerful of the sites. A couple of different changes have been made to it. One of them was the one that I definitely assumed was going to happen, which is that when you play a unit, it gets +2 health until your next turn instead of +3 health. That just keeps a lot of those units a little bit more under control. The Howling Peak units that were played both off of Mirror Image and off of like just being in front of the Howling Peak were typically indestructible and very hard to get rid of, which made Howling Peak itself very hard to get rid of. The other thing that has made Howling Peak a little bit easier to get rid of is that Howling Peak's durability has been taken from 5 to 4, making it, you know, about as durable as the most, like, it is no longer the most durable site, and it is, for its cost, I would say quite a bit less durable. This card has a lot more risk for its reward in it now. The abilities on it, Mirror Image and Gundown, are still extremely strong. The Caleb that comes off of it is no longer all that important, but the Caleb and Caleb's Favor both like were kind of medium impact things that could happen that almost never happened until after you were finished, but like basically Howling Peak can still get you 2 very good effects in a very short period of time. The question is whether or not your opponent can figure out a way to punish that. Howling Peak now being killable by cards like End of the Line and Mortar means that basically all of the sites can be accessed by 4 damage spells and other targets that like trigger a sizable amount of damage in a very short period of time. I'd say this opens up a lot of interesting counterplay to Howling Peak, and I really like the card still. I don't think it's a bad card by any means as a result of this nerf, but it is much more in line, and it's definitely going to be pretty exciting with a lot of like cool renown strats, of which there have been some mild changes to help those decks out as well. So we'll talk about the Quinn changes, or well, not so much Quinn changes, but changes to some interesting renown cards in the future. All right, one of my least favorite cards out of this current setup, Avagraft. This card was just like a little bit too basically oppressive, I would say, like as a 3-drop removal spell that plays essentially like a Slay, but kills most units for good and then causes you to have a lot of dead cards in hand. This card was not as oppressive or really just awkward as in Cold Blood, and the drawback for it was sufficiently difficult. Like there's some interesting things going on with the card, but I would say that it is a bit of a trap as far as like whether or not you need to destroy it to get the Entomb, or like what it is that you're going to do with it. I think the card just generally has had like far more advantages than disadvantages, this card has been moved up to 4. And yeah, I think that's a good change. Like, this puts it in line with a lot of the other slow speed removal. Since it is sort of in line with In Cold Blood, it's a very similar power level on that front, and since it actually has that sort of curse type effect where people can't play units with that name, you can no longer stack those curse type effects on top of each other in the way that Justice really seems really obnoxious Justice decks like to do, where you run like Avacraft and Citywide Ban and In Cold Blood. You probably don't run In Cold Blood, but like a Rain of Frogs if you're going for like a Huru list. Like, there were a lot of options where you could just kind of try to shut off as much of your opponent's deck as possible. It wasn't a great strategy, but it was a really obnoxious one, and this card like actually saw play in a lot of high tier power level decks, and frequently it would just be a roll of the dice whether or not you drew the card that was killed by Avacraft, and if you did, you were down a card for the entire turn, so it was very, very bad for you. Like, could be really, really tempo efficient way to just get an awesome 2-for-1 or an awesome 3-for-1, and then the banish ability just sucked up attachment removal in a way that was pretty bad. I'd say the cost nerf to this is enough that the card actually now has some interesting counterplay. There are some really good patterns to Avagraphs, so I'm happy to see it at 4. I probably wouldn't mind seeing it now that it is a 4-cost card, but yeah, I'm hoping that this will at least reduce it a little bit in the meta, because I don't want to see too much of this card as it gets a little bit frustrating over time. Okay, Levitate. Levitate has gone back down to 1 and can only be played on your units. So we now have a blue cantrip that we can play very, very quickly on our own units, but we can no longer use Levitate to pop Aegises and deal with some other like types of removal. I think this is a pretty interesting change. It allows you to get some interesting aggressive strategies across with Primal in a way that is pretty satisfying. Levitate basically dropped off the face of the earth after the Skycrag, like, or after the nerf up to 2. Like, this card was fringe playable, sometimes really, really good, but sometimes very, very bad depending on what type of deck you were in. And like, the ability to pop the Aegis on it was just always like a really neat toolkit that made the card really interesting. But when it became too powerful and had to be nerfed to basically 2, or then like it just became completely unplayable on every level. Now the card is allowed to use to sneak yourself across with infiltrate type decks, haunting scream type decks, anything that wants to basically just get a hit across to make a lot of bad things happen. And there's some really cool options with Levitate in Skycrag, in Feln, in a couple of other colors where you can actually do some really, really neat things with this. Like, you can do, of course, like the 2/3 Huru card that gets spell damage, Rilgon's Disciple. You can do Gorgon Fanatics again. Gorgon Fanatic Levitate was a very, very popular Haunting Scream style deck for a very long time. You can do anything with Infiltrate. You can do cool like spark type effects, and you can actually trigger spark again, which is something that's going to be relevant for certain types of spark decks. Like, I think there's just a lot of cool things that can happen with Levitate. I'm glad to see this card back in the meta, and yeah, this card coming back is really, really cool. Not being able to pop Aegises is not that sad. You can always use snowballs for that. There's a ton of different snowball generators, so like, you know, it's a little bit weird that this is no longer used for that intended purpose, but since the card was insanely strong before, apparently, like, yeah, I'm glad to see the card back, and I'm hoping it sees some cool stuff. Okay. I think the last round of patch notes, I saw somebody like getting really, really grumpy about Zalchi, Herald of War. Zalchi's a 7/5 with Charge, Entomb, play 2/4/4 Ruin Stalkers with Flying, and has seen quite a bit of play actually in red, yellow, blue decks. The main problem is that time decks in general, and red, yellow, blue decks in particular, have not actually seen a lot of representation. Zalchi is being buffed, has Overwhelm now. So 7/5 with Charge and Overwhelm, definitely pretty good stats, and one of the things that's really interesting about these types of decks is that, like, basically Praxis and the Praxis Primal set in particular, oh my gosh, we'll get this, it's not Aurelian, it's it's Genève, right? Oh my goodness. Yeah, no, because Ixtuna is red, green, purple, blue, so yeah, okay, so that's Genève. Anyways, Genève colors, like, definitely do some ridiculous things, like, yeah, it's instinct, there you go. So yeah, Genève colors do some really ridiculous things with this card, but the thing about Genève as a color is that it is a color that specifically does some good stuff with, like, a... sorry, Okay, specifically is something that does some very, very good stuff with single units all the time. Like, so Praxis in particular, and like also even with the Primal added on, these types of decks tend to play only one unit at a time. So you play, you know, your Sandstorm Titan on 4, your World-Bear Behemoth on 5, your Cerso on 5. On 6 you play Heart of the Vault, or you play like some sort of like big red nonsense monster. On 8 you have like something big as well. Like there's a lot of really, really large scary units in these factions, and so the way that you get value from these, if your opponent is playing a lot of removal, is that in addition to playing the unit, you have to have something good happen. Zelchi is something that like is specifically that's something good that happens, where Zelchi gets a decent amount of damage in addition to cards like Heart of the Vault, cards like World-Bear Behemoth. Like basically like these cards are a lot more capable of just getting across for a little bit of value and a little bit of advantage before they are removed. And Zelchi also has that lovely, lovely Entomb, which we don't see often enough because it's often killed without like silence before it's killed or things like that happen. But yeah, I think this is an interesting change. This card was already pretty dang good. And like the overwhelm ability definitely gives it a lot of extra beef. So we'll see if this pushes that color pairing and that color trio in a way that actually is going to have some fun. Also, this card is just now really, really good against sights, which I think was the intent with this buff, and certainly will be something that changes things up. Cerasor Bull is being changed from 7 to 6. That's pretty cool. If you want to play big dinos, Cerasor Bull is definitely a solid little charger. I would say this is a decent rare change to actually allow you some interesting attachment destruction options. You could throw this guy in a market in a dinosaur deck, or you could just put him in a main board. Like a 7/6 charge is really not all that bad, and being able to destroy an enemy attachment is kind of neat as well. I like this card a lot. It was not ranked playable before. It may be ranked playable now, and it's a really fun dinosaur, so I'm totally down with this one. Another card that actually got some love that I also really like, but was not particularly great, is Amaran Stinger, a 2/4 for 3 that has an infiltrate to put 3 Scorpion Traps on the top 20 cards of the enemy deck. Those Scorpion Traps are very, very good. Like in draft, this card is just a monster, and now it should be pretty close to a first pick, because 3 Scorpion Traps is ridiculous in draft, 5 Scorpion Traps is, well, just utterly insane. Like, that is just way too much value. Like, I would say that you should pick this card very, very highly in draft now, but now the idea is that it should be a little bit more playable in ranked, and I think I agree with this concept. Like, this is a charge unit, so you can now use it to kill some of the smaller sites, like the Torgoth site, if it ever becomes popular, or if you want to just, like, deal a little bit of extra damage to a site that is being played early, like Regent's Tomb, or Talir, then, like, that's a way that you can actually interact with sites in a way that is really, really happy. The infiltrate on this allows you to play it even if there aren't any sites and get some very, very good benefits from it. Specifically, something like 5 cards worth of advantage over the course of the game. I would say Amaran Stinger is pretty ridiculous. This card already played pretty well with Teacher of Humility decks, and yeah, at this point, it's definitely worth a shot. I'm not sure if the randomness of the Scorpion Traps or the value of the Scorpion Traps is going to come through for you in Ranked, but it's certainly a big enough upside that you should definitely be taking a look at it and trying some experiments with it if you haven't before. Alright, one last change, and I do really like this one. Derry Cathane Ripclaw Rider, a card that I think is actually quite strong, now has summon increase the cost of a spell or sight in the enemy hand by 1. So 2 cost 0/4 that actually like messes with your opponent's sights. I'm totally down with this. We have a deck that runs Derry that's kind of like counter spell heavy and wants to like do a lot of sort of interesting interaction, and like the main advantage to Derry is not the increase in the cost of spells, it's the ability to scout your opponent's hand and see what kind of stuff they have. Derry Cathane now looks at the sights in your opponent's hand in addition to looking at the spells, which is pretty good if you want to have more information on turn 2, and the extra cost means that you're going to be able to delay something by enough turns that you might be able to deal with it in a much more reliable fashion. Turning a Dizo's Office up to 8 is a very big deal. Turning a Howling Peak up to 7 is a very big deal. Turning a Regent's Tomb up to 5 is pretty ridiculous. Like, I would say that this has a very reasonable effect if you manage to use it on a site, but the overall extra like value that Derry is giving you, like, I think she's definitely doing exactly what you want. So yeah, seems very, very solid. Derry Cathane Ripclaw Rider is a fun dinosaur as well, and maybe we'll see some cool Elysian Dino decks for once. They've buffed a lot of things in Dino decks. I've never seen the deck actually be good in Ranked, but I'm very much hoping that it happens because, you know, dinosaurs are awesome. why not? Okay, so that's all of the site interaction buffs and nerfs that they are talking about, specifically to make it a little bit easier to interact and to have a few more interesting choices when it comes to sites. We also have some cool buffs to some cool cards that do not see play right now. The first of which is Vara, the Fate Touched. So this 8-cost 6/6 got completely nerfed out of the meta when her ability was changed from whenever you play another shadow unit, including Vara, to whenever you play another shadow unit. Basically, Vara being unable to get immediate value the turn that she was played was a pretty big deal. She's a very powerful card in that respect, and there were a lot of like ridiculous recursion things happening where Vara would bring back Vara, and you would just constantly get like so much value out of your void that it was impossible for people to recover. Felon Control was a really fun style of deck, and like there were certainly some interesting things that you could do with it. It was not my favorite style of deck, but there are a lot of people who are going to be very happy to hear that Vara has been given back the ability to play another shadow unit from the void when she is played. However, there is a drawback now. Vara now adds Voidbound to any unit that she plays back. So if you throw a bunch of cards in your void and you Vara into a Steward of the Past, then you get all of those cards, like that value is yours, but you don't get to repeat that effect with a Grasping at Shadows the next time that your opponent harsh rolls. So there's a definite like risk to the card now, like you no longer just always get value out of it as long as you have graveyard recursion, but you do get card advantage out of this card when you play it, meaning it's a pretty meaningful 8-drop, and I think it should see play in some shadow decks. Like, I'm pretty excited to see a Scion come back into play. Maybe we could see like some other cool buffs, but like overall, like this is a pretty solid change, and it means that most of the Scions are pretty playable right now, which is always lovely to see. Like, it sucks to have a card like this and not be able to do something cool with it. But yeah, that's pretty excellent. Anaya, Arctic Sheriff, got changed. I'm not sure why I can't find Anaya here. There we go. All right, Anaya, Arctic Sheriff has Pledge and is a 4/3. This card, I think, was already pretty solid, but like there were a couple of things that were kind of holding it back, like mainly the ability to be torched the turn that it is played, which means that if you stun an enemy unit and it gets torched, you have spent a 5-cost card and then had it removed by a 1-cost card, which if you're playing against tempo is just the death of you. If you manage to get the Renown off of on Anaya, Anaya is a ridiculous card, but the risk was a little too high and the reward was not good enough. Like basically an Aegis unit that locks down one of your opponent's unit is 2-for-1 card advantage in most situations, but sometimes since you had to spend a spell to actually get the card advantage, like there's some things about it that were just a little bit tricky. Anaya is now a 4/4, which means it's a little bit less vulnerable to some of those particularly damaging decks. It gives you a lot of decent defense, both in the ability to specifically pledge your way up into Hailstorm and other useful cards, and also in the ability to survive those hailstorms while also being capable of being torched and having like a lot of other like bad things done to it. Like it could already be torched because it got the Renown, but you know, like yeah, being able to like basically survive a little bit more punishment and trade a little bit better, I think really makes this card quite a bit better. This is now a 6/6 Aegis for 5, which I think is a pretty reasonable stat line as compared to a 6/5 Aegis for 5. And yeah, trades pretty well with a bunch of stuff, stuns enemy units, definitely has a little bit more power in here, and I think that she's going to be a lot more helpful for Quinn decks whenever they want to do some ridiculous nonsense. So yeah, seems good. Oh man, we've been waiting for this one for a while. Calderan Cradle is down to 3. I don't know, Calderan Cradle has always been a card that seemed like it should be 3, just because it is the 5-spell cost of the card is so hard to pay if you are also taking a turn off on turn 4 to try and get a bunch of spells out. And with the basic nerf of a lot of the like 1-cost cantrip cards, this card became not only like went from like basically unplayable to completely unplayable in a very short period of time. So yeah, like basically this is pretty ridiculous nonsense. Like this allows a lot of cool Cradle decks to actually come out. Cradle is now a card in on par with like Crown of Possibilities and a bunch of other like interesting 3-drop relics that actually do some really, really cool things. I think 3-drop is a great sort of slot for relics that do like these kinds of very deck-defining things, because it allows you to play these cards a little bit earlier, set up the thing that you want to set up, and actually sort of commit to that strategy in a way that's going to be a lot more satisfying. This also allows you to play a little bit more around like Tamaris the Geomancer, which previously would follow up Calderan Cradle in the most awkward time ever, where basically you would get the 4-drop and then you would have to play the 5-drop in order to start playing other cards that generally cost 2. At this point, Tamaris is now like a little bit more in line, because you can play some spells in between, and then Tamaris can discount the remaining spells to get you that 5/5 dragon on time. So I think there's a definite Skycrag deck out here. It's not going to be a ridiculously powerful card, but it should be good enough, and there's plenty of attachment destruction to keep it in check. Markets and smugglers make this card definitely not likely to really like sort of break out as like the standalone hit, but you can have some real fun with this card now, and I'm very, very glad for that, because this is one of my favorite goofy cards, and it's also got some just gorgeous art, both on the Cradle and on the Dragon. Okay, one last one that I think, man, I can think of a lot of people who've been waiting for this one too. Shard of the Spire is now 3. This makes it a lot more interesting as a draft card at the very least. Like, this card was barely even playable in draft just because the ability to play the unit was not that strong. But like, yeah, this is a fun card with a lot of fun abilities that are associated with it. Being able to actually play these kind of like awesome high health unit decks where you do like ridiculous nonsense with, say, the 0/7 clan Watchman, like that's like a kind of thing where you can actually do some really, really cool stuff. Like, there's so much fun associated with this card. It's a really, really good popper card for newbies, and like I think that like basically if you're trying to play like some cheap rare decks that have a lot of fun, having a 3-cost relic that actually does this kind of thing is just very exciting. This deck is not gonna be ranked playable still, I don't think, but you got some potential now, especially with Martyr's Chains now at the top of that 8-cost list, where you're playing just a lot of high health units and then you're doubling them up with also evening out their stats. This is exciting. You can definitely put it in a market now and maybe have a little bit of fun. I'm hoping it sees some play, but I'm doubtful. Regardless, it's definitely a good buff, and Direwolf is just like, yeah, they know where the fun is. They're definitely doing the right things. All right, finally we get into draft buffs and draft nerfs. Mighty Strikes has gone up to 3, probably very well deserved. This card was an insane renown trigger, and the ability to amplify it for 5 was typically just the best trick that you could possibly run. I think at 3 it's much more in line. It's still probably a very good card. The Overwhelm is very useful. The Amplify ability is very strong. Doing this at 6 to just trick out 2 different units and get an actual removal setup is definitely not bad. And yeah, like stats for cost, it's still a pretty effective draft trick. It was maybe playable in rank before, but I don't think it's playable in rank now. That kind of extra cost actually does make a huge difference when it comes to that kind of deck. Broken Wing Brawler. This was a surprisingly powerful card, but it's gone from 3/4 to 3/3. Empower, Flying, and Warcry is pretty good. Like, I would say this card is still very playable. It's just no longer capable of playing the defense game, where it sits on the board and blocks all of those 3/3s and 2/3s and like 2-drop cards that are generally going to like sort of stick around in draft a little bit more often. Broken Wing Brawler used to be both a card that actually created a stall and a card that broke a stall, making it one of the most powerful draft commons just because it was really capable of actually attacking across for lots and lots of value. And then like the Warcry ability was relevant as well. Like, all of this really contributed to being very strong in draft. I can see why they nerfed it. I'm a little bit sad because it's just like it's kind of it's a card that rewards really interesting card evaluation. Like, I think it's a very interesting skill pick because it doesn't look like a strong card, but it is actually very, very good. And I think it's still pretty good. You should probably still pick it relatively highly, but it's no longer the ridiculous monster card that it was before. It has a lot less uses, and it's mostly for decks that actually want to have that flyer every turn that can play the Entomb and can really benefit from the Warcry on a 3/3 flyer for 5, which, yeah, not at all bad. Blaze! Alright, This is definitely a needed buff. Blaze has gone from 5 to 4. I really liked this card. I like the art on this card quite a bit, and I also really like the ability. Like, I think it's an interesting interaction. It trades very well with a lot of different units. It just does cool things. And, like, units matter is a central theme of Winchest. It's not the same as the Warcry theme, but it's something that in draft should come out a little bit more often, and Blaze was just not a good enough payoff. This card, even if you were playing, like, a decent amount of scavenges, was like really just not capable of doing enough damage or gaining you enough health to make a difference. It would frequently be unable to kill stuff, and like because you had to pay so much for it, like that was a really, really big problem. There have been a couple of changes to make Unit Matters cards a little bit more important. We'll talk about both of those very shortly, but needless to say, Scavenge and Lazy Firemane are going to be playing a little bit more. But also this card getting cheaper allows you to, I think, pick it pretty highly. There are some really, really cool decks that you can build with Winchest where you go very wide and then you deal damage to your opponent and you just have a really, really fun draft theme. And then, of course, you can back it up with relic weapons like Curator Spear and Orc Roothammer. This is a fun draft card. I'm really recommending it now that it's going up to 4, so yeah, that sounds really, really exciting. Lethrai Intimidator. Okay, Lethrai Intimidator. Just Googling Lethrai won't work. Lethrai Intimidator is a 2/3 for 4, and it's going up to a 2/4 for 4 without the double shadow influence requirement, which means that the card's going to be a lot more playable in the color pairing that it's most famous for, which is Corendon. In Shadow Justice and Time, Lethrai Intimidator had some pretty cool abilities to empower and really sort of like help out the sort of not only the Winchest style of like lots and lots of units, but also the Corendon style of empower and the Aurelian style of making elves. This card is just sort of really well positioned in between those three factions to do interesting things, and the main thing about it was that despite that flexibility, the power level of it just wasn't there. But now it's got a little bit of something for all of those different setups. This is a card that benefits really well from Winchest Elves, where you get your, I think it's the 2/1 relic. I can't remember the exact name of it, but like basically the one that gives you the +4 4 power to give a +2 to an elf. That's pretty good on a 2/4, not so good on a 2/3. For the like Winchest style, where you're playing a bunch of rats and a bunch of wildcats and a bunch of other stuff, Lethrai Intimidator really sort of benefits you there. And for the Corendon style, where you're trying specifically to play empower effects with Lost Scroll and Display of Vision, Lethrai Intimidator gives you a bunch of buffs there. So yeah, this card is really, really cool. Like I think it's like a really good design, and overall just making it more flexible and to fit better into all three of those slots really sort of gives you some beneficial common design in a way that I think is really, really happy. I've said before that I think one of the worst nerfs that Direwolf actually made was a sort of side grade where they changed a bunch of commons in the previous set to 2-cost influence cards, where they were basically a little more powerful, but a little bit deeper in their particular setup. So, like for example, they changed the 2/2 Tribute Yeti from a 2-cost 1 to a 2 influence cost. And like the problem with that was that it made a lot of the like really accessible cards in draft, the cards that sort of gave you strong signals and gave you strong synergies, a lot harder to play, and it kind of just ended up with you like being a lot more screwed for picking things that were fairly obvious or like fairly interesting about a particular draft. Like you would just get influence screwed and bad things would happen. I think that these types of changes, these accessibility changes, make for a much more fun draft environment. I'm very excited about this particular change because it's the kind of thing that just really improves upon the experience of picking Corendon and also allows you to splash more colors and have a bit more fun with the types of cards that you're running and just chase more synergies down and try new things, which is always something that I'm very, very down with in draft. Okay. Oh, Resilient Wagoneer. This card was not very powerful because it was a 1/1 for 3. It's still a 1/1 for 3. But the Empower ability is now +2/+2 this turn for each of your units instead of +1/+1 for this turn for each of your units. So instead of being a card that they buffed to make a little better and a little bit more common with Empower, they actually made it a very interesting high-risk, high-reward uncommon. So, like, ridiculous nonsense can now happen with Resilient Wagoneer. I think combined with the pledge ability to just sort of make Corendon decks a little bit easier to cast, this makes this card actually really quite fun. You do have to figure out some way to protect your Resilient Wagoneer with like Strength of Many or Finest Hour, that kind of thing, but in draft this does make the card look pretty ridiculous, and I think it's got a lot of potential in that particular list. It's still not a playable ranked card. This card did not get any sort of buff that would actually make that happen, so I wouldn't worry about that too much. Scavenge. I'm not sure if Scavenge is better or worse, but I will say that it has higher synergy now. As a 3-cost card instead of a 2-cost card, it now plays 3 1/1 rats instead of 2 1/1 rats. Now, 3 3s for 3 are typically pretty good. However, this particular division of 3 3s for 3 is maybe not all that good. It's an assembly line that can't block, which was kind of the big benefit to assembly line in a lot of different setups. However, if you want to have a bunch of sacrifice tokens for like a Thornbeast style deck, like that kind of thing, then you can do some interesting stuff with it. One disadvantage now is that you can no longer use Scavenge specifically to buff up a Thornbeast early on, but you can use it for more aggressive win chest strategies that rely on large amounts of units, namely Rally, the Barbarian War Leader that plays Barbarian Camp. You can use it with, of course, Blaze and a lot of like Relics Matter stuff. This card really benefits Mob Rule, which is a pretty powerful removal spell considering the new changes to draft. And like, yeah, overall it just basically pushes that sort of win chest style of wide units combined with Warcry a lot better, and I think it's definitely something to play a little bit with now that it's got that whole thing down. Also, you can use it with that Clan Warcaller, the 4/3 that gets you Warcry on all of your units. Like, I don't know, there's a lot of fun stuff you can do with Scavenge now. I am totally into this change, even though it does kind of damage what the card did originally and change it entirely in intent, which is something that I'm a little bit more leery of as far as like what type of card it is that it's running. Still, it's definitely designed for that win chest style, and though it's a bit more focused on that style, it's maybe not more powerful as a result. Okay, Lazy Firemane. Lazy Firemane, I do like this change. So it went from a 3/3 to a 3/2, and the Renown is now played 2 1/1 Wildcats with charge. Lazy Firemane previously like didn't really reward Renown all that strongly. It was just a good unit that sometimes you got to buff up and then you get a dude. You never renowned this card ahead of time to get the Wildcat because the Wildcat was never really all that meaningful. Like, it just wasn't enough damage to make a difference one way or the other. So playing a Finest Hour on the Lazy Fireman was always a big risk for a really, really small reward, and that made it kind of a trap. Now this card is a little bit more difficult to keep alive, so it's more likely to actually be the target of Renown, and the ability to basically play more units means that you can do much more things with win chest colors, and indeed with Bare Arms, because you can definitely do some more cool Bare Arms decks where you play Scavenge and you play other nonsense and have yourselves a delightful, delightful time. So yeah, look for Bare Arms and Mob Rule and Blaze to all be better as a result of this card being changed, and also this card has gone from being basically just the common filler pick to a little bit more of an uncommon filler pick, but still a very strong choice in win chest and Renown decks. So seems interesting, definitely some cool stuff going on there. This last change I'm not really sure what to make of. Consuming Greed has been brought down from 5SS to 4S. It's a 2/1 flyer with a 6/4 Rust Fiend still attached. So it loses 1 point of attack, which is a big deal for flyers, but not necessarily the end of the world. The 6/4 Rust Fiend is a lot scarier that early, I would say, but like also that Rust Fiend was, you know, kind of an interesting reason to play the card in the first place. I'm actually not sure if this card is more or less powerful as a result. I would say I'm leaning towards it being more powerful, but a lot of the things that could answer a 6/4 Rust Fiend at 5 can answer a 6/4 Rust Fiend at 4. So the main thing that happens here is that you get a more accessible flyer with much worse stats, and then the relic that you play off of it is, like, you know, going to be something small, so it's probably not too big of a deal. I would say that this is still a decent card. Definitely, I think it's maybe a little bit better designed now that it's actually costing 4, because you have a lot more of that risk 4 reward, because you're specifically trying to get that Rust Fiend to matter. But the actual, like, stat line of the card is now not that good as a flyer, and that's something that's kind of important to note, is that this card can no longer push across for lethal, even if it is not going to get its summon effect. So you really have to get get that Rust Fiend out early, and you really have to get the value out of that Rust Fiend for that to happen. Yeah, like, it's hard to say that this card would not be stronger as a result, but I do think that, like, in draft, flyers matter, and even the extra point of strength on it might actually be worth the extra cost. So that's interesting. But yeah, like, overall, definitely seems like a buff. I wasn't too keen on this card before. I'm not too keen on it now, but it is still pretty interesting and a cool reward for Aurelian decks in general if you want to do some interesting sacrifice-style decks. So lots of fun stuff there. That is all of the draft changes. Oh my goodness, that took a pretty long time, but I definitely super worth it. All right, I'm going to go back to my stream now and try to stream with my terrible, terrible throat, but we are going to give that a shot. So thank you guys so much for watching. You can catch me on Twitch. I've got a Patreon and all of that stuff, and I really do appreciate all of you, and I hope that you have a lovely, lovely time with all the new balance changes. So see you next time, all you YouTubers.